Hello. I'm Tim, and I'm going to talk about the historical Jesus, just a general overview. There's a lot I could go into because there's so much sources and data out there. I have over 50 books myself on the historical Jesus, I think more, closer to 70. So there's a lot of information out there. I'm going to try to avoid talking about religion. It's going to be done from a purely historical perspective. I don't want to offend anyone who's extremely religious, but if you are extremely religious and you feel offended, feel free just to step out to the bar until the next talk. But I'm just going to try to talk about just the history part of the real man, Jesus. And so the question is, did Jesus really exist? Was there really a man called Jesus, or that we know of today as Jesus, who walked, who, saw the stars and the moon, who sneezed, who slept, who ate, who drank, who walked around on the planet Earth? Was there a real person behind, all this religiosity and all the Christian religion and everything? And the answer is yes. There really was a real man that, that all everything we know about the Christian stuff today all came from originally this one man who lived and breathed on the earth. So, some of the evidence we have. The four Gospels, obviously, in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they, even though they're very religious, there are historical kernels that historians can find from those four Gospels. We have the letters of Paul in the New Testament, which were written just about 20 years after Jesus died. So there were, when Paul wrote these letters, there were still people who knew Jesus' brothers. Paul went and met Jesus' brothers, and in his letters he mentions that. And Jesus' disciples, again, Paul met them, and then he wrote about them in the letters. So it wasn't too long after Jesus died. We have the Gospels in the Bible, of course. We have, he's mentioned in letters and books by and for Christians, but he's also mentioned in letters and books for the Romans, for non-Christians. And there's also the main source, not main source, but an important source we have about the historical Jesus is a writer called Josephus. Josephus was born about the time Jesus died, and he, about 60 years later, when he was about in his 60s, he wrote several books, two major books about Jewish wars and the antiquities of the Jews. Now these are huge, huge things. The Jewish wars is 8 volumes, and Antiquities of the Jews is 20 volumes. Altogether, get 28 volumes, huge, huge books on everything about the Jewish population up until his time, which was around the year 90. And Jesus is mentioned in these books. Jesus is mentioned twice in the book, The Antiquities of the Jews, about one paragraph and then one brief line. So I always like to think of it like, if there was someone famous today and someone wrote a whole book on like the 20th century or 21st century and someone got one paragraph, that's how popular they were. So Jesus was well known enough to be included in the book. There's so many people obviously that weren't included, but he wasn't so well known or popular that he had pages and pages or even a whole volume written about him. So about 60 years after Jesus died, he was well known enough by the Jewish population to get a paragraph, which is pretty good. But he wasn't like world famous like he is today. Everybody in the world, even if you're not a Christian, you've heard of Jesus. Back then he wasn't quite so well known, but he's well known enough by Josephus to be included. By the way, John the Baptist was also written about, and he got 2 paragraphs. So 60 years after Jesus died, John the Baptist was actually more well known than Jesus was by a little bit anyway. So, what do we know about Jesus from Josephus? There's a whole paragraph. I didn't put up the paragraph up here, but basically, the main points were that Jesus was a wise man. He was a doer of startling deeds, which historians assume meant the miracles, but all he says is startling deeds. It doesn't actually say miracles. He was a teacher, and he was someone who Pilate condemned to a cross. So he was killed by crucifixion. And crucifixion then was done by the Romans throughout the Roman Empire. So it wasn't like just Jesus was crucified. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people crucified. Today, the equivalent could be like an electric chair or a noose. When people do the sign of the cross, again, it could have been the sign of the noose or something like that. It was just a method of capital punishment back then. So there were a lot of people crucified, not just Jesus. We don't know much about crucifixion itself. Even though thousands of people were killed, there's very little written about it. But we do know from Josephus and from others that Jesus was definitely killed during the reign of Pontius Pilate. So what do we know about Jesus? Well, he died during the era of Pontius Pilate, which was between the years 26 and 36. And we know for a fact that that was the time period when Pontius Pilate reigned. Here's a stone, which it's hard to read, it's broken off, but it can be translated into Pontius Pilate reigned in this area between 26 and 36. And that's me there. Last year we were in Jerusalem, and we went to the area where this is. And so this is physical proof that Pontius Pilate existed. And besides Josephus, there's also the Gospels say that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate, the letters of Paul, outside Gospels. We have multiple sources saying Jesus died during Pontius Pilate. So we know Jesus died between the years 26 and 36, which is kind of cool. I mean, it's nice to know that there's that time period instead of some vague, he died a long time ago. It's like, no, we know he died. In today's calendar, it would be the years between 26 and 36. We can't really narrow it down any more than that, though. A lot of historians tend to think the year 30 for a whole bunch of reasons I'm not going to go into, because, like I said, I have 20 books just on what year did Jesus die between 26 and 36. But the general guess of 30 is most historians tend to think that's probably right. So what else do we know about Jesus? He was a Jewish teacher. That's the Sea of Galilee there. Again, these are pictures I took last year in Israel when I was over there. And this is looking out. The Sea of Galilee is actually a lake, it's not a sea. And in every language except English, it translates as lake, but in English it's sea. Don't know why. But it's a huge lake, but this is just a view. This would be the area that Jesus, preached. He went all around the Sea of Galilee to preach. So we know that about him. He had many followers, both Jewish and Greek Roman, and again, we know this from multiple sources. This here is supposedly the home of St. Peter, I believe right here. They built a whole new modern church above it. But right here, they think this may have been St. Peter's house. We don't know for sure. We know that Peter was born in this village and lived in this village, and Jesus found him in this village. And the Sea of Galilee is right over here. And he was a fisherman. So one of these houses was Peter's. We don't know if it's that exact one. The reason why they think it may be that one is they found graffiti on the walls here with crosses and all these messages to St. Peter. People just carving into it. And the carvings go back to within 40 or 50 years after Jesus died. So within 40 or 50 years after his death, people were coming to this particular house and praying there and writing graffiti. And so it's been there ever since. There was an older church built on top, and then they built this. They uncovered all this and then put the modern church on top of it. He was intelligent. Again, Josephus says he was a wise man, and if you read some of the parables and some of the things Jesus says in the gospel, some of them could be pretty clever, and so most historians think Jesus was pretty smart, which, back then, Jesus grew up in a very poor village. Most of the people there were not literate, and Jesus seems to have, we don't know if he could read or write, but he was highly intelligent, which was very unusual for someone like that to come out of a really poor area and get all these followers, and it's a lot to do with what he had to say and the things he came up with. They call it Jesus Spoke. It's almost certainly not a book Jesus was in, but it's from the time period of Jesus, from around the time he was alive, and it was found in the mud in the Sea of Galilee. So when the Gospels talk about Jesus, going in a boat across the Sea of Galilee, it most likely was this size, this basic shape, a boat very similar to this. It could be one he was actually in, but highly unlikely. But anyway, it's amazing that they found this preserved, and it's sitting in a museum there now, right on the Sea of Galilee. It's pretty cool. It's amazingly well preserved. Obviously, it's a lot gone for it, but consider it's 2,000 years old. It's not in bad shape. He was from the towns of Nazareth. Again, all sources say he was from Nazareth. He most likely was born there. I know two of the Gospels say he was born in Bethlehem, but they both give different reasons why he was born in Bethlehem. People don't realize that all these Christmas traditions we have are actually taking Luke and Matthew's traditions and smashing them up together, but actually it's two different traditions, and they don't actually match up. The reasons, one of them says he went to Bethlehem, Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem for the census, that they didn't live there. One of the other Gospels says, oh no, they lived there all along, and Jesus was born at their house. So again, both can't be right. And the Old Testament says the Messiah must come from Bethlehem, which is why Luke and Matthew probably had to come up with the story of why he was born in Bethlehem. And both of them say he ended up in Nazareth really quickly. But most outside sources say, no, Jesus was born in Nazareth, he lived in Nazareth, he was from Nazareth. Nazareth is a very small town, it's very rocky and full of caves. And it's basically here, around here is where Nazareth is. Again, Sea of Galilee is right here, and it's in there. Me and my husband went there again last year. It's all full of tourist shop, souvenir shop in Nazareth and that kind of thing. But you can actually go and see the caves and ruins of the homes there, which is pretty interesting. He had a brother James. Now a lot of people know that. Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters that we know of. But his brother James was the most well-known. He's written about a lot. He's written about in Paul's letters. Apparently he was a leader in the church, the early Christian church, along with Peter. Peter and Jesus' brother James were both the main leaders after Jesus died. But for whatever reasons, Peter became like the symbol of the head of the church, and James was kind of brushed to the side, and most people in history don't even know James existed. But in the early church, James was very important, and Paul even says this in his letters, that he had to get permission from both James and Peter to go on his quest to go around and talk about Jesus and to try to get people to convert to following Jesus' ways. This is a bone box that was found, and it's hard to read this, but and it's not in English, but it basically says, these are the bones of James, brother of Jesus. First of all, we don't know, Jesus and James were both really common names back then. So the chances that this is actually the bone box of the James, who was brother of Jesus, is pretty slim. But still, when it was first found and displayed, it's displayed at a museum in Toronto, which I went and saw, it made a lot of news at the time because, oh my God, what if it is the bones of the brother of the Lord? So a lot of Christians went there to take a look at it. But James and Jesus were probably 2 of the most common names back then. So it's probably just some other James, some other brother of Jesus. He's crucified. Again, we know that for certain because it's in all the historical sources in and out of the Gospels. This is a model of Old Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death. There's a temple there, and it's a pretty cool model. This is basically what it would look like back then in Jesus' time. It's pretty cool. His followers continue to talk about him after he died, obviously, because we still hear about him today. So a lot of religions, there were a lot of religions back then, but once the leader died, the religion died out. His followers didn't. They kept talking about him. In fact, they talked about him more after he died than when he was alive. And they went all over, as far as they could go, to talk about him and tell people about him. And so that's why he, and eventually in the year 300s, Constantine converted to Christianity, who was the Roman emperor, and from then on it became really popular after that. So unlike a lot of religions that just disappeared, he kept going. There's just another view of the Sea of Galilee there, which is a pretty cool view. Shows you really how it is a very big lake. And it's even shrunk some. It used to be, the water line used to be along here, higher up. And he spoke Aramaic. Again, Jesus didn't speak English. The Bible is actually written in Greek, but there's some Aramaic in them. Here's some example of Aramaic writing. But if you went and wanted to talk to Jesus, you'd have to speak Aramaic, because that was the everyday language of that area. And when he gave his talks, when he talked to people, he spoke in Aramaic. So Yeshu, and his real name was Yeshu. Yeshu is the actual name he was called. The Greek translation is Jesus. But if you wanted to, call Jesus over, and yell Jesus, he wouldn't know who you were talking about. He'd say, Yeshu! And he'd come over, and then you could talk to him in Aramaic. So Yeshu of Nazareth is the historical Jesus. That was his name. That's what he was known as through all these sources. I just think it's fascinating that he's like the most well-known person in the entire world, and has all these followers, and even people who don't follow him know of him, and yet nobody really knows anything about him. If people don't even think about, when was he born? When did he die? He probably died, like I said, around the year 30. He was probably born before 0 BC. He was probably around the year 3 or 4 BC is tentatively when they think he might have been born. So he was probably about 33, 34 maybe when he died. Early 30s is what they think. As I said, there are historians that devote their entire careers to just studying the historical Jesus. People who aren't religious, but just historians, just looking at the data, all the data out there. And as I said, I have close to 70 books myself that I've read. I don't know why, I've just got fascinated with it. I'm a big history buff, and especially on American history and world history, but one day I just read a book about the historical Jesus, and I was fascinated, all this stuff I didn't know, and so I just wanted to read more and more, and I keep reading more and more and more, and I go to Israel, and I took this class, and my husband thinks I'm crazy because all I do is read stuff about the historical Jesus, and I'm an atheist. But I just find it fascinating, and so I hope you got a little bit of sense. Again, this was just a general overview, but it is a fascinating thing to hear about the real man that walked this earth. Thank you.